If you would, open up to Matthew chapter 5. Looking down in verse 42, we're going to try and finish up chapter 5 this morning, and then we'll be able to start in chapter 6 in January when we come back on the 7th. If you remember in verse 38, it was all about an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and in all three times in the Old Testament, whenever this quotation comes out of, it deals in terms of with your neighbor. It deals in terms of with a woman who's pregnant with a child. It deals in terms with someone who's a false witness in court. And to go, if you're going to seek these things, he says, this was the repercussions that you would justly receive. And so we've already gone through some of these other aspects with Jesus in verse 39. He says, but I say to you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. And on the surface, this sounds like, wow, this is pretty high. Who really does that? And in the end, who actually does that? Jesus does. To think that whenever those soldiers are slapping him and they're even saying, prophesy and tell us who it is, I kind of wonder if he couldn't tell them exactly how many days they had left in their life and who their parents were and who their grandparents were. And yet at the same time, he doesn't respond to those things, except for he allows them to slap him again. To think of the same Jesus, the same Christ, who is the Creator, is allowing the created to literally slap him around. And it's all motivated out of, I'm going to show you mercy. I'm not going to give you what you deserve right now. Then verse 40, if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. And we talked about at the foot of the cross in John 19, here are these 4 soldiers and a centurion, and they divide up his garments into quarters, a part for each one of them. And then they find one specific garment that is just one woven piece, and it's valuable to them, so they don't want to divide it. And so he doesn't put up any fight. He doesn't say, that's mine. They want to take one, you can have the other as well. And you think about, it's a pretty cold day, by the way. If you remember earlier in the morning after Peter has denied Jesus, Peter and many others are around a charcoal fire warming themselves. And to think of giving away your clothing or it being taken away from you, to see the self-sacrifice in this. Then, verse 41, whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. And we talked about in Luke 24, about the 2 on the road to Emmaus. Jesus looks like he's going to go further than where they're going to go, and instead he stops and he actually eats with them to share a meal, and that's when they discover who he really is. And so you see how Jesus doesn't give back what is just to these people. He in turn shows them a lot of mercy and a lot of grace. And to go, this is what you're really dealing with. Then, verse 42 says, give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. Now, because of so often the physical-minded society we live in, this sounds almost like, well, man, what if they asked for all of my house? What if they asked for not only my first car, but the second car that we have? And I want you to realize, make sure you tie this to where it's coming from. Look back at the Old Testament. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 15. Deuteronomy chapter 15. Look down at verse 7. Deuteronomy 15, verse 7. If there is a poor man with you, one of your brothers, and when you think about brothers, what's he really talking about? Your kinsmen. For them, it would be other Israelites, is probably the way they would think of that. It could even go so close as to like a blood family relationship. He says, if there's a poor man with you, one of your brothers, in any of your towns in your land which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart nor close your hand from your poor brother. Now notice what God points out. Whose land is it? It's God's land. He says, I'm giving it to you. But if you have a poor brother, he says, don't harden your heart. Which, can that easily happen? You go, well, you got yourself into this mess. And the heart gets hard and goes, and then he even goes so far as to say, nor close your hand from your poor brother. In other words, I'm not going to help you. You're the one who did this. Verse 8. But you shall freely open your hand to him and shall generously lend him sufficient for his need in whatever he lacks. Now notice, he says, whatever he needs, he says, you better open your hand and you better share it with him. Now, I'm going to recall another story from Luke 15. Do you remember whenever the lost son comes back home, what the father does? Does he not provide for him? I mean, he sees the clothes that he's wearing, he says, give him a robe, give him shoes for his feet, give him what's needed. And you realize, isn't that God opening his hand? His heart's not hard. He sees what's going on here. Then he says, lend him sufficient for his need in whatever he lacks. And I know you see lend, but I want you to remember in the Old Testament, you couldn't even lend something out at 1% and be right with God. That comes out in the book of Nehemiah. God's people start lending out at 1/100th the rate, which is 1%. And God rebukes them for that. I know for us, if somebody says, hey, you can have this loan for 1% on your car, you'd probably go, man, that'd be a great deal. But you understand, not in Israel. That's not pleasing to God. Now, hold that to the old covenant. We'll get to something here now. If you're a banker, don't worry. But notice what else is here, verse 9. Beware that there is no base thought in your heart, saying, the 7th year, the year of remission, is near, and your eye is hostile toward your poor brother, and you give him nothing, that he may cry to the Lord against you, and it will be a sin in you. Now, if you remember, what happened every 7 years? Debts were forgiven, and so you would have a little bit more monetarily. And then, of course, after 7 of those 7s, you'll get to the year of Jubilee, and then all the land would actually go back to its original family owners. If you ever wondered why all that stuff's written down in the book of Joshua, it's because they needed that as a reference every 50 years. So he continues on here, and he says, don't just think, well, you know, if I give them, I don't give them anything here in the next 6 months, they're going to be fine once we get to there anyway. It'll be the end of the 7th year. Everything will work out fine. He says, don't think that way. Then, verse 10, you shall generously give to him, and your heart shall not be grieved when you give to him, because for this thing the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all your undertakings. What sticks out to you in verse 10? Yet, don't grieve in your heart, and look at what the Lord's going to do with it. Going to bless you. Here's the aspect really to kind of hone in on in verse 10. He says, you shall generously give to him, and your heart shall not be grieved when you give to him. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation like that where you go, I feel like I got to give, but I don't want to give. I don't know if you've ever been put in that situation. Once again, what is God addressing? The heart. You see him go back to heart. Then he says, you do this, he says, because for this thing the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in all your undertakings. If you just separated this blessing out and said, do you want the Lord to bless you in all your work and in all your undertakings? Who wouldn't sign up for just that aspect of it? And go, well, yeah, that's what I want the Lord to do. And he goes, then how are you at looking at the needs of others? And you go, oh, well, I didn't know we were talking about that. But you realize how God's looking at this. Because weren't we once the one that was poor? Whenever we were estranged from God, how were we going to buy our way back? We couldn't. And what did God do? He extended his hand and said, let me pay your debt. Right? And aren't we thankful? Now, verse 11. He says, "For the poor will never cease to be in the land. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall freely open your hand to your brother, to your needy and poor in your land." He says, there will always be people who are less fortunate, we would say. Is it really fortune? Not really. But the idea is there's always going to be a people. I mean, even if you lived, just go out here ways with me. If you live in a community of people who are all millionaires, somebody's the poorest millionaire. Right? I mean, there's always going to be poor. And so here's the statement. No matter what situation is, and sometimes, you know, you can think about probably earlier times in your life where the person who was thought to be rich maybe only had $50 to $100. And other people who only had pennies. And to go, there's still a help. And still, God's looking at that. It's not about big dollar amounts. It's about the heart. Now, once again, in the Old Testament, we're not going to take the time to read it. But do you remember what they were told to do whenever they were farming? Could they harvest all the way to the edges of the fields? No, they had to leave the edges. If you kind of think about turning a plow, I almost think like in a rectangular field, you just get an oval pattern. And so you end up leaving the corners and the grain is standing. And to go, if someone was poor, what were they allowed to do? They could go in and they could harvest. They still had to work for it, but this is what was theirs. And you might think, what if the corners have already been taken? And all of a sudden, here's your brother, and you say, oh, well, you can go out and glean the corners. They've already been gleaned. Now what do? Do you close your heart, or do you extend openly? Here's what I have, and here's what I'll share with you. Now, so whenever you start to look at these things, come back to Matthew chapter 5. It says, give to him who asks of you. It doesn't mean necessarily you give him a finished product. You know, some people look at the ingredients, you know, for a recipe, and they think, well, this will never turn into anything. But then you got to do a little bit of work, and it all comes together, right? It doesn't mean you always have to hand over a finished product. And there has to be some responsibility in this too. So then he says, give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. I want you to think through this next aspect. How many people did Jesus turn away who came to him to be healed? I mean, like, you can't think of one. But I'm going to take you to one that's an almost, but there's a reason for it. Look over at Matthew chapter 15. We're just going to hit this real quick because later on we'll be in chapter 15. Look at verses 21 through 28. I want you to notice his disciples. I want you to notice their attitudes because we're going to need that in a minute. Matthew 15:21. Jesus went away from there and withdrew into the district of Tyre and Sidon, which is along the Mediterranean Sea. Verse 22. And a Canaanite woman from that region came out and began to cry out, saying, have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is cruelly demon-possessed. Verse 23. What's his response? But he did not answer her a word. On the very beginning surface, what does it look like is about to happen? It looks like he's going to ignore her. Like he's not even going to do anything. Like he's being asked, but he's not responding yet. He says, and his disciples came and implored him, saying, send her away because she keeps shouting at us. What do the disciples have to think about this? She is a bother. Just tell her to leave. Now keep in mind, Jesus hasn't said anything at this point. But the disciples are saying, man, she is such a bother. Why don't you just make her leave? She just keeps shouting at us. Notice it doesn't say she kept talking to them. I mean, she's shouting. I don't know how you feel about whenever people are shouting at you. I mean, you can understand a little bit about why they say, just send her away. But take note, because there's something going on here the disciples need to learn, and we need to learn too. Verse 24. But he answered and said, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Once again, how does it sound? Sounds like he's not going to do anything because she's a Canaanite woman. She's not an Israelite. He says, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. You're not of Israel. And so she takes those words, and look at her response. Verse 25. But she came and began to bow down before him, saying, Lord, help me. What's she call him? Lord, I might not be of your herd, but will you help me? Lord, help me. Verse 26. And he answered and said, it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Wow. You start to look at this. He says, even for her to be called a dog. Wow. This kind of takes you back, doesn't it? This is the way Jesus is talking to this foreigner. But there's a payoff here, and there's a bigger point. He says, it's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. He says, I can't take the Israelite bread and give it to the Gentiles. I don't know if you've ever been called a dog. It usually doesn't make you feel really good. Look at what she does, though. Look at how in tune she is. She calls him Lord, and whenever you call somebody Lord, you got to listen to their words. And look at what she does. And it tells you about her heart. He says, but she said, yes, Lord, I agree. She doesn't say you're wrong. She says, yes, Lord, but even the dogs feed on the crumbs which fall from their master's tables. He says, maybe you can just give me a few crumbs. You take care of the children first. Are there any crumbs left over for the dogs? You notice how she doesn't go, I'm offended, I'm leaving. Because what would the disciples have done at that point? Yeah, she's gone. She takes what Jesus says and she makes the application. And is she right? Because you're going to listen to what Jesus says, now we're going to take it in. He says, yes, Lord, but even dogs feed on the crumbs which fall from their master's table. Verse 28. Then Jesus said to her, oh, woman, your faith is great. When did she start having faith? She already had it when she showed up. Did the disciples recognize it? No. Did Jesus know it? Yes. So he uses this situation to teach a lesson to who? The disciples. Now you see what he's doing. Because notice he says, oh, woman, your faith is great. Can you imagine the look on those disciples' faces? We were begging him to send her away, and Jesus says she has this great faith. He says, it shall be done for you as you wish. And her daughter was healed at once. Once again, notice, does Jesus say, okay, let me make this the easiest possible way I can on you? Here's someone who's come to ask for something. He says, let's use this to learn. Let's see, are you really going to listen to the voice of Jesus or not? Because if at any point she goes, hey, he's just sent to the lost sheep of Israel, I'm out. If she stops, what happens with her daughter? Nothing changes. Hey, been called a dog. I'm out of here. I'm offended. Then nothing happens with her daughter. But because faith is what's working on the inside, guess what you're looking for in terms of people that you're going to help? Is there any faith here? Because the statement back in chapter 5 is, what about people who ask? He says, don't refuse them. But if you give them all the physical stuff and you haven't addressed the spiritual, what good have you really done? What's the real benefit? I mean, if Jesus would have come to earth and says, you know what, I'm going to make everyone prosperous when it comes to physical things, and he left, what would have been the benefit? Inflation. But you start looking through and going, that wouldn't really be a big help. Let's take a look at God. Look over at Luke chapter 6. Luke chapter 6. And once again, remember, Luke chapter 6, starting in verse 20, is really a parallel all the way through the end of the chapter with the Sermon on the Mount. It's just in a more condensed fashion. But it gives some extra details to some things. Looking at I want to just start in verse 35 for time's sake. He says, "But love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return." You mean lend, expecting nothing in return? That sounds like you might not get paid back. Yeah, that can be the case. He says, "And your reward will be great." Well, I wonder what the great reward is. Well, read the rest of the verse and tell me what the great reward is. You'll be sons of the Most High. He says, that shows you're my children. He says, love your enemies, do good, do what's beneficial for them. He says, and lend with an expectation of nothing back. Now, if that's just something they want to pay back for their conscience sake, that's okay. But as far as it depends on us, you don't have to pay me back for this. Then, notice the application. For he himself is kind to ungrateful and evil men. How far does the kindness of God go? All the way. Is it dependent upon whether they have gratitude or not? No. How many times is that our limitation? They're not grateful for what I gave them. We're looking in the wrong direction, aren't we? Because why did we give it? Because it's what our Father gave to us. Right? He says, he himself is kind to ungrateful and even evil men. So what if a gift is given but it's not used in a good way? Is God going, oh, sorry, you failed. You should have looked out better. No, we have to be wise with it. I'm not saying that we shouldn't. But look at what's going on here. When you think about Jesus, remember the story of the 10 lepers that he heals? And only one of them returns to give gratitude? Yet, where did the kindness of God, did he not heal all 10? And you think, here's all this kindness, only one comes to show gratitude. Right? He says here, he's kind to ungrateful and evil men. In a different story in Mark chapter 1, there's one leper who comes up to Jesus, bows down before him, begs him to heal him. He says, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And Jesus says, I am willing. And he is cleansed. And then Jesus next tells him, now, don't tell anyone. And do you remember what the leper does? Telephone, telegraph, tell a leper. I mean, it goes all over the place to the point where he can no longer even go into the cities as easily as he could. I mean, there was a reason why Jesus said that. So here's someone who is treated well, but doesn't give back what's good for it. He's not obedient. And you go, Jesus already knows the outcome. He already knows that those 9 weren't going to turn back and have any gratitude. He already knows that this one leper, in this other story in Mark chapter 1, he says he knows that he's going to go tell. Does he let that stop him from healing them? No. How many times do we think the reverse of going, yeah, but they're not grateful. Yeah, but they're not going to do something that's beneficial for other people with this. They're going to be evil still. The real question is it for me to really go, you know what, I got to make 100% call on where their heart is before I can respond? No. Do I still need to be wise? Yes. I mean, we're not going around and doing things that are intentionally going to trip people into evil. But do you see, whenever you're going to really respond like God responds, he says he is kind. And this word for kindness is the word of, I'm going to treat you right even though you treat me wrong. Even though you're still going to do evil, I'm going to do what's right. Even though you're going to be ungrateful, I'm still going to do what's right. He says, for he himself is kind to ungrateful and evil men. Then verse 36, be merciful just as your Father is merciful. Is that not what mercy is? You don't deserve this. You deserve something completely different. But that's being withheld for the moment. So, whenever you come back over to Matthew chapter 5, and to see these things all together, whenever this statement gets made, he says, give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. To go, all right, is my heart ready to give, expecting nothing in return? Because who is really looking at what's going on? God is. And what we saw in Deuteronomy, he's saying, the way you see those who are helpless now and interact with them, he says, understand, this is the way that I interacted with you when you were helpless. When you were in your sin, and you were evil, and you were ungrateful for everything I provided. And you go, oh yeah, that's what led me to him. God's saying, are you going to be like me? And you think, this is exactly what Jesus did in his life. He didn't always say, oh, I see you're hungry. Let me scrape up everything and do this for you. No, here's some groceries. You'll still need to do some cooking. Here's some things that you can put together and make it work. There's still some responsibility given. Now, notice here as it continues, and really this all flows right into this next aspect, verse 43. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Wow, that sounds pretty easy. You really have to have a commandment for that? He says, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now, here in verse 43, if you notice, it is a quotation out of the Old Testament. There's a couple different places you can look, but let's look at one in particular, because if you've heard it said, you know it's in the Old Testament. Look at Leviticus chapter 19. Leviticus chapter 19. Look at verses 17 and 18. Remember, you've heard it said, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. Leviticus 19:17. You shall not hate your fellow countrymen in your heart. Once again, what is being dealt with? See how this heart thing really matters? Verse 17, Leviticus 19:17. You shall not hate your fellow countrymen in your heart. You may surely reprove your neighbor, but shall not incur sin because of him. Now, if he's doing what's wrong, don't hate him, but you need to love him enough to actually have a conversation if they're doing sin. Then verse 18. You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. You go, no grudges? He says, you can't hate them. And you realize here he says, but you're to love your neighbor as yourself. And once again, this is about looking inside of the heart in your own, and once again, in Leviticus, when he talks about fellow countrymen, we're dealing with Israelites. Then, see if you can understand how they might come up with that thinking over there in Matthew 5. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 23. Deuteronomy 23, look at verse 3. If you remember, the passage in Leviticus ended with, I am the Lord. He says, if you think grudges are okay, if you think hate's okay, he says, you're not recognizing me as the Lord. Then, and that's just dealing with their own countrymen. Then you get to Deuteronomy 23. Look at verse 3. No Ammonite or Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord. None of their descendants, even to the 10th generation, shall ever enter the assembly of the Lord. How does it sound like if you're an Ammonite or a Moabite? Are you welcome here? No, not until we get to the 10th generation. Now, who's the most famous Moabite you know? Ruth is probably the answer, I would imagine. And yet, you know how many generations away she is? If I want to take a guess? 10. It's as if God already knows exactly what's going to unfold in the centuries to come, because he does. But he says it this way. He says they're not allowed to come into the assembly. And it just so happens that Ruth is in the lineage of Jesus himself. Verse 4. Here's why. Why are they not allowed to enter the assembly? He says, because they did not meet you with food and water on the way when you came out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam, the son of Beor, from Bether of Mesopotamia to curse you. He says, here's why. He says, they're going through all these things. He says, can you understand why they might start to think that way? That it's okay to hate the Moabite or the Ammonite or people who aren't Israelites? You can maybe get a feel for it, but look at verses 5 and 6. He says, nevertheless, even because of that, he says, the Lord your God was not willing to listen to Balaam, but the Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you because the Lord your God loves you. Now, here, even though you're met with opposition, look at what's still going on. He says, other kings have actually hired men like Balaam to come in and curse you. Prophet, nonetheless. He says, but what still abides? I love you. If you have an enemy who hates you, and they do all kinds of terrible things, what do we need to remember? God still loves us. And then you even go to the next level, and God loves them too. Now, verse 6, you shall never seek their peace or their prosperity all your days. He says, you don't go in terms of going, I'll do whatever it takes for this to work out, because that can easily go on into evil. And so you see the picture at hand. Now, come back over to Matthew chapter 5. He makes this statement, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. You can kind of understand how they could get off base on that, except for the fact of it specifically talks about, you got to remember that no matter how you're treated by other nations and other people, you are still loved by God. Because how often do we go, whenever we're being mistreated, maybe, when you think earlier in life in a workplace, maybe you think about, a neighbor who's really got it out for you, it feels like, and you go, why am I being allowed to be treated this way? I wonder if that Syrophoenician woman thought that at any point. Why is Jesus not willing to help? Because it might just be that God is using you to teach something to his people. Will you be willing to be an instrument like that? Because that's who that Syrophoenician woman, she was thought to be hated. I mean, even the disciples she's shouting at us, get rid of her. Kick her out of here. Give her the what for. But Jesus knows what's working in her heart and that there's faith there. So often in loving our enemies, we just don't seem to think, could the gospel really change their life? You ever encountered some really rough people and wondered, whew, this would be a tall order? Whenever you think about the New Testament, who is probably the number one candidate that everybody had written off? He's persecuting the church. How could anybody think we should love Saul? Don't you know what evil things he's doing to God's people? And yet, whenever Saul is converted, Ananias has to be told by God to go in and have this conversation with Saul. And Ananias almost has that thought of, you sure this is the right person you're talking about? Don't you know that he's been out persecuting your people? And yet, when Ananias is willing to go there, what is he doing? Is he not loving his enemy? And because he was willing to love his enemy, Saul comes to the gospel, baptized, his sins are washed away. And then, even in Damascus, the Jews start to persecute him. He'd really jumped to the other side of the fence now. And then whenever he gets down to Jerusalem, do you remember who has to step in for him to be accepted? Remember Barnabas, son of encouragement. He has to take Saul in to where the apostles are and say, look, I've heard him teach about Jesus. This is not a show. And you go, there's a love, but somebody has to be willing to love. And that's where the power of God really takes over. And we have to be willing to say, like that Syrophoenician woman, I'm willing to be used. Let your word apply. They can call me whatever they want to call me, but I'm going to serve you. And did the Lord not take care of her? Don't you think her faith was refined through this? Now, you notice it here. He says, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. As part of these things over and over again, just think through some of the stories you know in the New Testament. Well, actually, let's just look at a couple. Look over at Luke chapter 18. We won't look at a lot of this, but just a little bit. I want to show you the hatred they had for some people, even their own countrymen. Luke chapter 18. Verse 35. As Jesus was approaching Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the road begging. So how would you describe him? Blind beggar. Okay. He says, now hearing a crowd going by, he began to inquire what this was. They told him that Jesus of Nazareth was passing by, and he called out saying, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And look at the compassion of the crowd. Tongue firmly in cheek. Verse 39. Those who led the way were sternly telling him to be quiet. That is the most unique way of saying shut up. I mean, sternly telling him to be quiet. I mean, what's the language you used whenever your kids were younger? Sternly tell them to be quiet. How did you put that into words? Sit down, hush. However, I want you to see, this is the value they saw in this blind beggar. He's not worth anything. He's crying out for Jesus, even calling him Lord. I mean, Son of David. And then, notice as soon as they tell him to sternly be quiet, verse 39, he kept crying out all the more. He kicks it into a higher gear. Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus stopped and commanded that he be brought to him. And when he came near, he questioned him. And he says, what do you want me to do for you? And he said, Lord, I want to regain my sight. And Jesus said to him, receive your sight. Your faith has made you well. And immediately in verse 43, immediately he regained his sight and began following him, glorifying God. And when all the people saw it, they gave praise to God. You look at this picture together and you see all of a sudden, and there's another account of this, where whenever Jesus cries out for him, it says some of the people said, oh, he's calling for you. Like, you're telling me to be quiet 1 minute and now you're saying he wants to talk to me? Two-faced, hypocrite. Then, if you notice the point here, here's Jesus interacting with faithful people, even whenever the crowd has no compassion. Now, and once again, notice, this blind beggar, once he sees, what's he going to do? He's going to follow Jesus. He's not like that leper who went and disobeyed what Jesus said. He steps out. The next part, you see a new heart in chapter 19 of Luke, and it's Zacchaeus. We won't go through every detail here, but whenever all of a sudden Jesus calls for Zacchaeus, look at verse 5. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for today I must stay at your house. How's that for? I guess you can't invite yourself to somebody else's house. Then, verse 6, and he hurried and came down and received him gladly. When they saw it, who's the they? It's the crowd. They all began to grumble, saying, he is gone to be the guest of a man who's a sinner. How do they feel about this? Are you catching on that the disciples in the crowd aren't necessarily always good examples? And I think we can look at our own selves in life sometimes and go, I wasn't a good example at that. I need to change that. But specifically here, who are God's enemies? You ever thought about that? Were we ever God's enemy? Yeah. And to go, aren't sinners enemies of God? Because a sinner is someone who is actively sinning, going against what they know to be wrong. And you go, here's the way the crowd looks at Zacchaeus. He is a sinner. And then, if you notice here, of course, Zacchaeus' heart completely makes a turn and what he puts before. But I want you to see how the people see him. The people saw the blind beggar as he's not worthy for Jesus to even talk to you. They looked at Zacchaeus, who is a wealthy tax collector, and whenever Jesus calls for him, they grumble because Jesus shouldn't have time for him. He's a sinner. And you can think about other stories, like Luke chapter 7. Do you remember the woman who comes in? She is known, her reputation in town is as a sinner. And Simon, a former leper, is hosting a party for Jesus. And as soon as she comes in with an alabaster vial, and she starts to pour it out and talks about head and feet of Jesus to anoint them. And you see Jesus interact with her. The people who are there, remember what their reaction is to her? If this man was actually a prophet, he wouldn't let this woman touch her. What does that tell you about the way they saw her? She's a sinner. She's an enemy. This is not what should be done with enemies. And yet by the end of Luke 7, Jesus is saying to her, go, your sins are forgiven. Go in peace. You see what Jesus is willing to do? Where are we at on this? We ready to love enemies? You even think John chapter 4, remember the Samaritan woman at the well? And the disciples actually go back into town. And the moment that Jesus speaks to this Samaritan woman, you remember what her questions are? Why are you talking to me? I'm a woman. And I'm a Samaritan at that. Like, she's even shocked. I think that's the most fun shock to give somebody who feels like they are completely unnoticed by everyone, and then to have a moment to say, hey, how are you doing? You're going to talk to me? Then later on, whenever Jesus' own disciples come back, do you remember what they're saying? Why is he talking to her? They don't get it either. And sometimes we miss it just like the disciples do. And you realize, we got to have some love in this process. Now, you see Jesus do this so often, then come back over to Matthew 5. We'll stay here. Matthew 5:44. I say to you, love your enemies. And look at what love means. Sometimes it's just the listening. Sometimes it's to defend someone in the presence of others. He does that with many people. Then he says, and pray for those who persecute you. What is the height of Jesus' persecution? When he's being crucified. Remember what his prayer is? Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Boy, is that our response when we get persecuted for doing what's right? Remember earlier in the Beatitudes, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake? He says, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Is the heart really there to hunger and thirst for righteousness when you get persecuted for doing what's right? Now, if we're persecuted for being a knothead, that's different. But being persecuted for doing what's right, to go, this is Jesus. How do you pray for your enemies? Well, number one, are you going to forgive them? Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. You want mercy? It'll be shown in the way you treat your enemies. That'll really show your heart. It'll expose us pretty quick. If we're bitter, hard-hearted, hateful in words, sometimes you encounter people, you talk to them, you think, I don't know that they can actually say a kind word. Yeah, but can we? Can we pray for them? Then notice the outcome, verse 45. So that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. What's on the line? Your relationship with God. If we can't love our enemies, what's God going to say about us? You're not my child. You didn't learn that from me. Now, you think about the moments as a parent when you see your kids do things and you go, they didn't learn that from me. And you think, what a shame. And we did the same thing to our parents. But you go, here's what's at hand where God's saying, you love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you so that you can be sons of the Father. Because that's when you're really going to come to understand what love is. You think we really grasp the depth of the love of God when He offered up Jesus? What it would take to offer up the only one to ever live a perfect, sinless, holy life on behalf of all of God's enemies altogether. He says, love your enemy. Pray for those that persecute you, so that you may be, notice it's may. This is contingent. May be sons of your Father who is in heaven. And then notice His kindness. He says, for He causes His sun, S-U-N, to rise on the evil and the good. Does He show kindness? Does the sun just rise on the righteous? No. He says, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. I mean, can you imagine the scenario? If all God did, if you were righteous, you got sunshine and rain. And you actually would have crops to grow. And then what do you think the people in the darkness and drought would do? I don't have any food. Would you be willing to help me? And if you had love, what would you do? If you said, you know what? Don't refuse the one who asks of you. Because whenever your enemy comes to ask, how much humility does it take? It's almost like that's the last person I'd ever want to ask. And now what are you going to show? Mercy. But once again, God doesn't put us in that situation exactly because He gives His rain and His sunshine, whether they're good or evil, whether they're righteous or unrighteous. There's the love of God. And realize, God's love always goes in one of two directions. If we're going to walk hand in hand with God, it's a different type of love than whenever we're going to walk as rebellious against God. Because if we're going to walk rebellious, who's He going to try and point us to? There needs to be a returning to God. Is it still love, though? Yes. See your brother sinning? Well, you got to point that out. That's love. Do it in a gentle and kind way. But notice here, it really hits them home, verse 46. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Not even the tax collectors do the same. He says, and by the way, this is the word agape. If you agape those who agape you, if you will sacrifice self for someone who will also sacrifice themselves for you, he says, what reward do you have? What's the payoff? Now, I want you to think about this, just in a statement. Can God get ungodly people to agape on a certain level? Yes. Do you ever get kind of amazed by that? We see maybe a grandparent or a parent sacrifice for their children or grandchildren, and we go, boy, they seem like really good people. Jesus says, I can get tax collectors to do that. I wonder if Matthew enjoyed writing that part down, being a tax collector himself. But going, that's the way, people despise tax collectors, just like with Zacchaeus. They said, he's a sinner. Why would Jesus talk to him? And to go, you know what, it's one thing if you just love the people who love you back. Isn't that one of the easiest things in the world to do? But the real question is, what about those that hate you? What about those who, even though you say something kind, they go, they don't really mean that. They don't like me. They're going to interpret every good thing as something evil. Does that mean we stop? It means we've got to keep going. He says, if the level of agape is just when somebody treats us right, he says, you didn't learn that from your Father in heaven. He says, do not even the tax collectors do the same? Verse 47, if you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? He says, even Gentiles can greet people who are Gentiles. Remember how shocking it was to the disciples when Jesus greets a Samaritan woman? When Jesus is willing to have this woman who is known to be a sinner comes in and anoints his head and his feet. He says, he actually is talking to her? What's wrong with him? No, what's right with him? That's what we need. Then he says, I can even get the Gentiles to do that. And you think about the way the Jews looked at the Gentiles and tax collectors. It'd be like saying, I can get your greatest enemy to do these things. So why are you boasting about doing the same thing? Where's the reward? Then he comes to verse 48. Therefore, probably one of the scariest verses if you don't think about everything together. Therefore, you are to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. How many of us are willing to go, I'm out? I was with you. I can't be perfect. The idea behind this Greek word for perfect is about maturity. Now, I want you to think your way back through what we've been looking at here in Matthew chapter 5. And I want you to think about how love has been the aspect of it all along. And it's about immaturity to drawing close to perfection, learning it from the Father. You think in terms of do not murder. That's immature love. What is maturity? Control your anger. There's maturity. There's perfection. Because does God's anger get out of control? Never. Never. You take it back to do not commit adultery. There's the immature love. What about a perfected love? Be careful with your eyes and your hands, what you desire and what you touch. He says, there's maturity of love. Because here is someone who is married to another. Are you going to love them, to treat them well, and to understand the boundaries and the limits? Same thing goes with murder. You understand they're part of a family. Others will be affected if their life is taken. Will you love them? Then he continues on down to talk about in terms of what about divorce? He says, don't get divorced unless it's for someone being unfaithful. And you go, why? Isn't there a care and concern for their soul? Isn't that mature love where you start thinking in terms of somebody else's soul? And you realize there are exceptions that are there that are written. Hold those tight. But you see, here's mature love. It's about looking out for the soul, controlling anger, making sure I control my desires. This is perfected love because even God sent Israel and Judah away. Then you come to the next part of going, oh, what about these false vows? He says, what about your word? What if it's not something you actually have an oath or a vow on? Will you just keep your word? Because that's love. And isn't that what God does with us? To keep His word in every promise. That's maturity. That's perfection. Then, even going further in terms of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, it's all about justice. What's mature love go after? I'm going to show you mercy and grace. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. And then even on down into this, he says, don't just love your neighbor. He says, love your enemy and pray for them. He says, all those are the aspects of perfected love. He says, is there a hunger and a thirst for righteousness? Is there a purity of heart to see God? He says, it's all right here. And to understand, too, when you see it, this is really what salt and light should be. Is that who we are? And if it's not who we are, is that what we're drawing near to try to be? To be a child of God. Because that's the greatest reward that we can ever have. Now, we'll kind of close out there. Good news for you. Brent's going to come back January 7th, and he's aiming to teach that class. So you'll get a good teacher again. All right. Y'all have a good break, and we'll meet back together January the 7th.